In this lecture, we're going to be covering beekeeping equipment, the tools of the trade. So there's a lot of equipment that we use in beekeeping that is going to be necessary to protect you, to protect your bees, to give them a home. All of these pieces of material have interesting names, and you as a beginning beekeeper probably want to know what all these things are and what they do. And so what I'm going to go through today is just some of the basic equipment that we utilize as beekeepers to familiarize yourself with the construction of a hive, the parts of a hive, and the tools that we use to be beekeepers. So there are three basic tools that we utilize as beekeepers. And when I was learning how to become a beekeeper, the big items, we had this mantra with my mentor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where we basically, the mantra before you went out to a bee yard is, what are the tools you got? You got a hive tool, smoker, and veil. Those are your three basic items that you're going to need to have when you plan to go to the bee yard. The hive tool basically allows you to work the beehive kind of like a pry bar. The smoker plays a role in there, and then obviously the veil is for protective equipment. So each one of these items is really important. Now, when it comes to hive tools basically, like I said, they're essentially pry bars and scrapers. So they're usually comprised of a prying end and then some sort of a sharp end to be able to scrape things like fur comb off with, or to get in between two hive bodies to break them loose. Bees, as they reside in hive bodies, they produce a tremendous amount of propolis, which is like glue, and they will glue everything together. So when you come out to work a beehive that's been sitting there, you're gonna have to break apart boxes, you're gonna have to break apart frames because they're gonna glue everything together. And that's where the pry bar aspect of this comes into. And then, of course, the scraping aspect, being able to get in there and scrape things. There's lots of different hive tools out there. These are three hive tools that I use in my own apiary. I am a fan of one in particular, which is the hive tool that I typically use, but you'll be exposed to all three of these styles of hive tools. So we have our traditional hive tool here, which has a sharp end here and then a pry bar end there. We have the J-hook tool here, which utilizes this hook mechanism here, which allows you to pry frames out a lot easier. It gives you leverage. This is my favorite hive tool. This is the hive tool that I use all the time. And then this right here is called the Kent Williams hive tool, which essentially takes these two hive tools and puts them together. A lot of folks refer to this as kind of the Cadillac of hive tools because you get to all the best of all the worlds, but it is a much more expensive hive tool. So typically the Kent Williams hive tool, I want to say that's like $15 to $20. The J-hook and the traditional hive tool, you can get these for like $6 a piece. Now, when it comes to hive tools, you want to make sure that you have a few of them. I can tell you when I started beekeeping over 10 years ago, essentially, you buy one of these and you're thinking, oh, this is my hive tool. I'm going to have this hive tool. It's going to serve me well. Well, you're working out in remote yards, and oftentimes hive tools fall on the ground. They get covered by grass and you lose them. I generally tell folks, when you buy one of these, buy a couple of them, just to have around. I guarantee you're going to lose one of these at some point, and you're going to need, these are critical tools to be able to use. So you want to make sure you have it. The smoker is really a critical piece of equipment to use when you're working your hives to keep your bees calm. Essentially, a smoker is filled with fuel like pine needles or leaves or burlap or pretty much anything that'll smolder and produce a cool smoke. When we smoke the front of a beehive, oftentimes that is basically giving them the signal that a forest fire or some sort of fire is coming towards them. And the response of that is that the bees will go in to the hive, gorge themselves with honey in preparation to be able to leave the hive as an evacuation because there is a fire coming. Well, that's good and bad. When we're working beehives that are kind of fussy, that are being a little antsy, smoking them kind of calms them down. They gorge themselves, and what that does is it extends their abdomen a little bit, and they're less likely to sting you. And they're a little, they're full of food. They're it's kind of like after Thanksgiving dinner. Most of us after Thanksgiving dinner aren't going to go out and do some real physical activity, and in this case, like attacking a predator or someone that's attacking us. We're pretty docile after those big meals. So it's kind of akin to that. The one thing I want to warn you of, and this is something that we will practice in the class, is that you want to use smoke at a minimum. A lot of people over smoke beehives, and that's not necessary. Anytime we are smoking a hive, we are putting stress upon the colony. It is now outside of its normal operation. We want to minimize that to an absolute minimum. So oftentimes, and what we'll be demonstrating in the Heroes Hives program, most of the hives are always going to be very docile. There are some times when we have hives that are a little more aggressive than others. That's genetic. But most of the time they're very docile. And we will demonstrate, and I will teach you as we go through the course, how to open hives and not really utilize a lot of smoke. The practice that you see here of a beekeeper smoking the front of a hive before it's ever open, that's not a practice that we practice here. Essentially, we will open hives without smoking them at all, and we will start working the hives in a slow and methodical manner. As long as you're slow and you're not disrupting things and you're not smashing bees or moving quickly over the hive, they are not going to react to you very much, and everything will be just fine. Over the course of time, while you're working down a beehive, you're going through a few boxes, they'll get a little testy because the hive's been open for an extended period of time. That's when you can utilize a little bit of smoke. And by a little bit of smoke, I mean some puffs of smoke. We don't want to go in there and smoke out that entire hive. That's not what we're trying to do. Again, part of being a good beekeeper is being gentle with the organism and understanding that your actions and reactions will get an equal and maybe even a more severe reaction from the bees. So make sure that you approach this very calmly, very slowly. The role of the smoke, in addition to the honeybees engorging themselves and all of that, it also kind of acts as a secondary, it also has another primary function, which is to mask pheromones. So bees, when they start to get antsy, they will release alarm pheromones, and those pheromones will be smelled. You will be able to smell them. The bees will react to them, and those alarm pheromones are keying everybody that something's going on in the hive. When we add smoke into the mix, it dilutes those pheromones, and so it kind of masks the pheromones so that the bees are a little less agitated as well. Veils, they're going to come in all sorts of styles, from simple drawstring head veils like you see here on the left, to jacket styles like you see here in the middle, to full suits. And there are several types of fabrics available: nylon, canvas. There's the cooling fabrics. I have a suit that I use now that is one of the cooling suits. It's a jacket, and it's really nice. The canvas stuff is hot in the middle of the summer, so being able to be comfortable is really important. But when it comes to the style of veils that you're going to be using, a face veil works just fine as long as you have appropriate clothing to go along with it. Jacket's nice if you want a little bit more protection. The full suit obviously is a lot more protection. I honestly I've never owned a full beekeeping suit. I've never felt the necessity to do that. Jeans work just fine when you're working a beehive. Jackets are kind of nice. I typically utilize my jackets when we get near the end of the season and bees get really testy because of robbing. So they'll get a little more aggressive in the fall because they're trying to protect their food. But typically, through most of the season, you'll see me in just a face veil and a t-shirt. They're very docile for the most part, and you really don't get stung that often. What this really though comes down to is personal preference. If you want a lot of protection, you're going to need more protection. If you want little protection, and face veil will do just fine. That's what we're going to provide you when you come to our workshops. It works just great. But if you do want a little more protection, that's something that you will want to rectify or recognize. You will also notice that there's many different hat styles. So this with the face veil just kind of comes over like a safari hat. This one has kind of a wide brim hat on it. And then this is our typical English style hood. I've worked with all of them. I prefer the English style hood to the kind of the hat style here, mainly because this hat will flop around as you're tipped over. And I don't like that. It doesn't stay on your head, tight. Whereas this really doesn't move around with you very much. This works awesome. I'm a big fan of just the face veils. Gloves. So most of you are going to want to wear gloves when you first get started. That is totally normal. When I started beekeeping, I had the big leather gloves, and because you're uncomfortable with being around venomous insects. Totally understandable. However, the one thing you need to realize is that is a place to start. It is not a place to stay. And the reason is that in order to be a good beekeeper and have good hive handling skills, meaning that you are able to handle the hive appropriately, methodically, smoothly, you need to be able to have some dexterity. You need to be able to feel what you're touching. And big leather gloves typically are very difficult to deal with. They're clumsy. You end up smashing a lot of bees when you wear them. But it is part of beginning. So when you get going, I'm not gonna force you to get away from those gloves until you are comfortable. But you should realize that you want to get away from them. As you evolve as a beekeeper and become more comfortable, nitrile gloves are a really great option. So nitrile, typically bees, when they land on them, they don't recognize that as a surface that they would sting, so they don't typically sting through them. Now, I do have students that will tell you they do sting through them, and they will occasionally, but typically they don't. And if you really want some protection, if you double them up, they will not sting through doubled up nitrile gloves. But the advantage of that is, one, now you have dexterity because they're tight-fitting gloves, so you can feel everything. But number two, if you're concerned about diseases, maybe you have an apiary that's, you have a hive that has European foul brood, having nitrile gloves that you can work that hive with and then take off and replace is a great hygienic practice to preventing the spread of disease. So it kind of is a twofold purpose. The final evolution of this is to go gloveless, and most experienced beekeepers do not wear gloves. You will see me go both ways. I usually like to wear nitrile gloves when I know I'm going to be dealing with hives with a lot of propolis in them. And we do have some hives in our apiaries. We manage about 50 colonies. We do have a couple hives in our apiaries that produce a tremendous amount of propolis. I mean, the stuff is just gooey throughout the entire hive. And I will put on nitrile gloves in those cases because by the time I'm done working it, the gloves are so sticky that you just want to get them off. And that will all transfer to your hands. However, having your hands free and being able to feel everything is really, really important, especially when you get into things like marking queens. Doing a wing catch on a queen, meaning that you pick her up by her wings very quickly, any type of glove that you have on doing that is not going to be a good thing. You need to have that sense of touch and that ability to feel in order to be able to do those tasks very, very well. So gloves are, again, a personal preference, but over time, especially when you're working with me, if you're participating in on-ground events, I will talk with you about the want to move on from those leather gloves. And starting there is fine, but it is not something that you're going to want to stay at over time. So we've had the lecture around the topic of Lorenzo Langstroth and the Langstroth hive, the idea of bee space being about somewhere between 3/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. It's the space that allows two bees to pass one another in a beehive. So that is the modern beehive that we're utilizing, and that is the hive that we're going to be utilizing throughout the Heroes to Hives program. Now, keep in mind, there's lots of different hive styles. This is the only hive I'm going to teach you on, and the reason for that is this is the hive that we are most successful with in northern climates. Some of you may not be in northern climates, but this is what we use in northern climates and what most successful beekeepers utilize in here. And it's simply because of the way the hive is constructed. Bee colonies, when they're overwintering and when they're clustered, they move up in the colony, feeding on honey stores as the winter progresses. So you have to have stores of food above colonies in order for them to make it through the winter. And that's what the Langstroth hive offers. In these pictures you would see here, we have two deep boxes. Those would be our brood chambers, and then a medium up top here, which would be a honey super. And essentially the bees as a cluster will start down here and they will move up over the course of winter. Without having stores above them, colonies typically will not survive in the winters in northern climates. This is the beehive, the modern day Langstroth hive, and we're going to go through each one of these components here so you know exactly what it is that you're looking at. The first one is a hive stand, and hive stands are an important component to really any beekeeping operation. You never want to set your bee colonies directly on the ground, and a stand serves really a few purposes. First, it keeps the hives elevated, that allows to aid in keeping pests out of the hives like ants and mice. And also, a little bit of height on there will help with things like other predators like skunks that will eat bees. So, getting a little height on there is a really good thing. In addition, it also allows for some airspace down there so that you have an air cavity underneath there. That also comes into play with wintering. And for us, those of us in areas that have snow, having it off the ground allows that, that snow level to not always block our entrances. So hive stands come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. What we use in the Heroes to Hives program is a very, very simple approach. We actually just use 2 cinder blocks, put on their ends, and we set the hive right on top of it. And those work really, really well. The nice thing about those is they're very easy to level because you want the hive to be level when you set it. Very easy to work with. In addition, something as simple as a pallet also works. So, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It definitely can be very, very rudimentary. You just need to get them off the ground. The bottom board is the first portion of the actual hive. It's the physical bottom of the beehive. It's where bees are going to enter and exit the hive, and it comes in really two basic styles. The solid bottom board, which you see on top here, and then the second is a screen bottom board. The screen bottom board differs really in that that the area immediately under the upper hive body is covered in this metal screen, which allows an area underneath the bottom board that typically has some sort of a plastic underneath it. So we have a screen here, and then underneath this is a corrugated plastic. And what this really allows for is it allows for, in the case of varroa mite or other pests, if the pest, in the case of varroa mite, the idea behind this was, from an integrated pest management standpoint, was that as mites fall off of bees, maybe bees are, hygienically removing them, or they just happen to fall off of the bees, they would fall through this screen and wouldn't be able to get back up into the hive. And for a long time, this was advertised as a method of actual varroa control, was through these screen bottom boards. We since have realized that that is not the case at all. This does not offer you control, but it does offer you the ability to see what's going on in one respect. If you're doing varroa mite treatments, basically the way that this works is that if you're doing a varroa mite treatment with a screen bottom board, you're going to see mite drop. You're going to see dead mites falling. And so you could actually look at this board before, clean it off, put it in, put a varroa mite treatment in, and then after the treatment is complete, look at the board and get a sense of how many mites are dropping. However, this is not an appropriate way to monitor mites, and it is not an appropriate way to control mites. I have both types of bottom boards in my apiary because I was part of that group that we, when this first came out, we thought this was going to be a method for controlling varroa. I have since gone to all solid bottom boards. As far as from a wintering standpoint, you can winter with screen bottom boards. I have several hives that have screen bottom boards that winter just fine. But really, the advantage of it is to see kind of what's going on. They're a lot more expensive than the regular just solid bottom boards. And again, it's just a method for you to have kind of a peering in view of what's going on in the case of like mite drop or something like that, but not something that you're going to use as a management method for varroa mites. The other things that I kind of like about, one of the things that I do like about the screen bottom board is, like, on really hot days, this offers a lot of ventilation for the hive. But again, it's not an integrator. It's not a pest management tool. It is a way to determine, kind of get a sense of mite drop overall. The next piece is the entrance reducer, which typically comes with the bottom board when you buy it. It has two basic positions, a large and a small opening. And it basically allows you to regulate the size of the entrance based on the time of the year and the needs of the bee in regards to defending them from potential intruders like yellow jackets or other bees from other hives. Typically, you want the entrance on the small setting in the cold months. So like right now in the winter, all of us should have these on the small setting when there's little activities from bees moving around in and out of the hive. But as the hive becomes more active and grows in population and is able to defend itself well, you're going to start opening that opening more and more. And so you would go to the bigger opening as time progresses. And then at some point during the season, you probably will not have this on at all. During the height of honey flow, there's not a lot of robbing going on. So bees are just coming and going as they please. So having a full open entrance with a robust colony is just fine. Now, in the case of weak colonies, you may have this on the entire year because you're trying to limit that area that they have to defend. Just like in military operations, if we can get a small area that we've got to defend, say like a bottleneck or something like that, it's a lot easier to defend a small area than a broad area. So it just comes down to that particular thing. In addition, this also, is a way to manage airflow as well. So, obviously a bigger entrance is going to have more airflow. You would not want to have, in a very, very, very hot day, you would not want this to be on at the smallest entrance because you're just not allowing enough airflow to come through. The next piece are our hive bodies. Now, there's all sorts of different sizes of hive bodies available. Deep hive bodies measure at 9 5/8 inch deep. Now, deeps are definitely something that's part of regular beekeeping. We also have mediums and shallows that we deal with. Now, when it comes to the size of the box that you're using, it comes down to preference. I will tell you this, if you are dealing with some sort of a lifting restriction, like it's tough to lift things up, deep hive bodies that are 10 frame orientations are going to be very difficult for you to work with. A deep hive body, when it's totally full, say of honey, for example, which would be the extreme end. Normally we don't use these for honey supers, but if you use this as a honey super, you're going to typically get about 80 to 90 pounds out of that thing when it's full. And that is a hell of a thing to have to move around. Especially keep in mind that the movement of a beekeeper, you lift up the hive and then you twist and set it down. So that twisting motion for a lot of us is very restrictive. So 10 frame hives are something that is very traditional, but you see a lot of 8 frame hives now. And I myself, because I do have a back injury, have actually we've moved our entire operation to 8 frame equipment, because 8 frame medium equipment. So we don't even use deeps. But the reason is because I cannot lift. And over the course of my beekeeping career, it is typical every year I at least throw my back out twice, to where the point where I am down for a couple weeks. And that's not good for a beekeeper. Going to 8 frame equipment, we made this transition last year and the year before. Last year was the first year in my beekeeping career I have not had a back injury. And it was because I'm using smaller equipment. You have to have more of it. So, in order to replace 2 deeps with mediums, you'd have to run 3 mediums in place of 2 deeps. So it's a little bit more equipment. But this, again, is a personal preference. Whether you do 10 frame equipment or 8 frame equipment is going to be up to you. But I would encourage you, if you are dealing with physical limitations, especially regarding lifting, that you want to consider 8 frame equipment. It is a much easier thing to deal with, and medium hive bodies overall. So you can use them for all your brood chambers and your honey supers as well. So just a little personal advice on that. However, these are called hive bodies, and they basically just contain frames. And so you can see within each one of these hive bodies, we have frames. The next item that we see on here is the queen excluder. Now, queen excluders are used basically to keep the queen out of the honey supers. And really, it comes in all sorts of different flavors. You see metal ones, you see plastic ones. I don't typically use these a whole lot. A lot of times when we are using them, we're manipulating hives to produce queens or something like that, or perhaps using a swarm control method. But generally, the queen really, keeps kind of a tight brood chamber. Usually over 2 boxes, deep boxes is all she's going to create. It's typically kind of in a oval shape, the brood chamber. So really, depending on having one of these around or a couple of these around is not a bad idea, but you're not going to use them very regularly. And we'll talk about that a lot in a later session. As far as honey supers are concerned, well, honey supers are the supers that are having honey put on them. So you can see in this situation, this photo actually shows a queen excluder right here. So the queen is isolated down here. And then the foragers, or the workers, are the only ones that can make it through that screen. That's why it's a queen excluder. Workers can make it through, queens cannot. But that queen excluder in between that honey super you see right here is making sure that all that's going on in here is honey. Now, a 10 frame medium box that measures at a 6 5/8 inch height, when it is full of honey, will weigh about 40 pounds in a 10 frame orientation. So you reduce 2 frames on an 8 frame orientation, and you're reducing about 7 or 8 pounds. So it's a little bit lighter to deal with. But that is where the honey is going to be stored, and that is all that's going to be stored in that area. Now, there are also shallows. Shallows, same idea, just a little bit of a shorter box. 5 and 11/16 is the typical height for those. And they're the lightest option, a hive body available. When they're full of honey, you're looking at about 30 pounds. So again, just options for you to consider, especially when it comes to lifting. The smaller boxes you get, you're just going to have more of them, but they're easier to move. Frames and foundation. Frames are what fill the boxes, so the hive bodies. They are the basis of the Langstroth hive, and really is what allows you to move things in segments. So we're not dealing with a whole hive at once. We're dealing with 1 frame at a time. The frames are matched with the size of your hive body. So ensure that you have the right frames for the right hive body. If you put medium frames in a deep hive body, what will happen is the bees will make a mess of comb to fill that lower portion of the colony. And typically, in a lot of situations when they make that comb, it's often drone brood. So yeah, just make sure that you have the right frame for the right hive. Foundation is something that comes in lots of different flavors. Frames also, so you have wooden frames here, and then you also have plastic frames. I am not a fan of plastic frames, and I'll tell you why. The reason is when you use plastic frames, especially in a deep hive body, when you pick the hive body up above it, typically the bees will actually create propolis or wax in between the top box and the bottom box. And when you try to pull this box off, lots of times because of the lightness of the plastic frame will come with it below it. And that's a pain in the butt to deal with. Typically the wood frames don't do that. And just from experience, I've just not really been a big fan of the all plastic frames. When it comes to foundation, which is basically that sheet that you see right here, it is the foundation from which the bees will draw comb from. You can see that they're already segmented into shapes, the hexagon shape that bees will use to draw that comb out. That comes in a lot of different flavors. So you have wax foundation, which is beeswax, which many people like to use. Wax foundation is great. It's more expensive than plastic foundation. Bees do make very good comb off of it. However, if you are making your own frames with beeswax, you have to wire those frames, and there is an actual process to that to make sure that they're wired incorrectly. The reason is that if you don't wire these incorrectly, when you go to extract, these frames will blow out entirely because there's not a solid, I mean, the wax is a lot more flexible than a plastic foundation. So you have to make sure these are wired incorrectly. There's an entire process to that. And it is something that is kind of there's not as many beekeepers using wax foundation as there used to be. The other option is plastic foundation. So it'd be a plastic sheet that pops into this wooden frame. You can buy plastic foundation in both coated and uncoated. When they say that it's coated, it means it's coated in beeswax. Beeswax coated foundation is always the better option because the bees are more likely to draw comb off of that because it already has wax on it. It's got kind of the smells already of a beehive. So I typically, in all of the Heroes Hives apiaries, you're going to see plastic foundation on wooden frames. That is something that we really prefer. And mainly it's because it's very quick to put together. Instead of having to wire in the beeswax foundation, you just pop it in. You literally just pop it into the frame. So it's very easy to put in, very quick to put together. I've never had any issues with bees pulling comb off of them, unless it's not coated, in which case there can be some issues there. But for the most part, work very well. Very easy to work with. But again, it's an option. Some of you may want to keep it all beeswax. Some of you may want to, have something that's a little easier or more efficient to work with. So again, it's just up to your preference. The last part of our hive internally is the inner cover. Now, the inner cover sits between the honey supers and the outer cover of the hive. It basically prevents the next piece of the hive, the telescoping cover, the top cover, from being propolized or glued to the hive body. So it just gives you an opportunity to where, when you take that top cover off, it's not solidly glued to the hive itself. Now, what this really allows is when you're disassembling the hive, it makes it much easier when you're using a telescoping cover. But inner covers are not always required. I run a lot of migratory beekeeping covers, which are basically just a piece of wood that goes right on top of the hive. And the reason I use that is because they're cheap, and we don't run an inner cover with that. So that is fine, but when I go to pry those up, it is glued down very tightly to the hive. The other advantage of dealing with an inner cover is a lot of inner covers will come with notches in them for a top entrance. A top entrance is always something that you should have on a beehive, even during the regular part of the season. The only time you really don't want a top entrance is when you have a new hive that is just kind of getting going, because it's another entrance that they have to protect. But a top entrance offers for great ventilation, especially during the summer months. You want to make sure you have a top entrance. And whether your inner cover comes with one or not, you can always notch those for a top entrance. The final piece of our beehive is the telescoping cover. And basically this is just protecting our hives from the elements. They come with this aluminum piece on the top of them, really good for weather, all of those types of things. But again, there's other options. And I use a lot of migratory covers. We haven't purchased telescoping covers in many, many years. And covers come in many different ways, shapes and sizes. You'll see migratory beekeepers that will just cut up pieces of plywood and use plywood on top of there. That works fine as well. The telescoping cover is a little more of an expensive option, but it does give you kind of that, you've got that lip where, it's going to allow for rain to kind of drop down instead of running down the sides of the hives. So it's got some perks on there as well, but it is a more expensive piece of equipment. So as you gain and scale, if you're running 10 hives, 10 top covers that are the telescoping covers, not a big deal. If you're running 100 hives, it is a much bigger deal because it is a much more expensive investment. Feeders. So there are all sorts of feeders available for beehives, and there are pluses and minuses to all of them. So you're going to be feeding your bees in the beginning of the spring, typically before lots of forage comes on. We might got to make sure that we have feed on these bees so that they have plenty of food to continue to build up. In addition, in the fall, when you have weak colonies that haven't put enough stores on over the winter, you want to be able to feed them as well. So feeders are something that you're going to have, and it's just a matter of deciding what type you want. What you see right here is the Boardman feeder. The Boardman feeder is kind of a feeder that a lot of beginners like to use, and I actually recommend it for a lot of beginners. And the reason is that if this is your first time keeping bees, having something outside of the hive that you can visually see how quickly they go through this sugar water is important to get a sense of what the bees are doing. So in this case, with this size of a mason jar right here, in a strong colony that's feeding, you will see this gone in a couple days. So it really illustrates just how quickly they are moving through that food. The nice thing about it is you don't have to open the hive to get to it. So you can just pull that off, put a new one right back on without ever even disturbing the hive. Most of the time, I don't even put on a veil when I'm doing something like this because you're not interfering with the bees at all. But it's just a very easy thing to do. And if you only have a couple hives, it's really easy to mix the sugar in there. So, you see, these are actually my parents right here. You can see that my mom right here is mixing a jar right there. So we, 1-to-1 sugar water, we put in 1 part sugar, 1 part water, and just mix it by hand. Doesn't require a paint mixer or anything like that that you would need for other types of feeders that are larger in capacity. So it's a good place to start, but I will guarantee you that you will have to replace these a lot. So if the bees are at your house, very close by where you can check on them every single day and see how the feed's doing, these are perfectly fine. If you have a remote apiary that you're going to go to like every couple weeks, this is not an option because they will blow through this in a couple days. What may be a better option is a top feeder or a frame feeder. And I don't have a frame feeder pictured here, but a frame feeder basically takes the slot of a frame inside of the hive. They're typically about 2 gallons in capacity. And you basically fill it. It's on outside frame, so it'd be like the 10th frame in a 10-frame hive. You would fill that, and they have access to feed that way. But you have to open the hive to do that. A top feeder is another option. The top feeders go right on top of the hive, and these come in lots of different styles. This is one particular style. This is my wife, Lacey, here using a 5-gallon bucket full of sugar water and filling these. These hold about 2.5 to 3 gallons of sugar water. So you would get, a week or a week and a half out of this. So you'd have to visit much less frequently. The bees have access to the sugar water that resides underneath these lattices. So the lattices float on the sugar water so that the bees have a surface to walk on. Bees are terrible swimmers. So they will, if you have these just open, they will just drown. The bees come up into here through this middle here. So there's a top cover on here. And the nice thing about this is that there's no way for other bees to rob this. So it's not an open food source. And it's a really good, efficient way to feed your bees. These are kind of pricey, but it is an option. A cheaper option would be just a bucket. You can find bucket feeders all over the place, 2-3 gallon buckets. You can make them yourself. I know Ace Hardware carries like 2 and 3 gallon buckets that we can utilize for bucket feeders. And typically what this is just some sort of a container. And on the top of it, we've perforated some holes that allow for sugar water to drip out. Now, the thing you have to make sure is that whatever device you're using to do this, that when you flip it over, that it holds vacuum. So initially you will see sugar water drip out, but essentially very quickly that will stop, and it'll basically hold a vacuum. And so that allows the bees to come to it and eat from it rather than it just pouring all over them. The disadvantage of bucket feeders is that if they lose vacuum, sitting right above the colony like this will all drain out into your hive, and it is a mess when it does. And I've had it happen several times. You can't, you just got to make sure that your equipment is clean and up to snuff. But if it's not sealed properly, this will all drain out, and that is a mess. So, pluses or minuses, but this is a very cheap way to feed lots of feed. I use this on lots of our hives. This is how we feed our Heroes to Hives, beehives as well. So there are many variations in the world on basic hive setup. There's lots of different hives out there nowadays, everything from top bar hives, Ware hives, AZ hives, flow hives, all of these different types of designs that are out there. And although I encourage you to explore and encourage you to check out these other hive choices, For the climate that we live in Michigan, and those of you that are outside of Michigan, this may not apply to, but in Michigan, the Langstroth hive really is a great hive to work with. Again, it's oriented so that the food is directly above the colony as it's going through the winter, which allows it to rise up through the colony. So in this course, this will be the hive that we will be using. If you've got questions about these other hives, you're welcome to ask me those in the Q&A sessions, but we will be focusing solely on the Langstroth hive for this beekeeping course. All right, with that, I will say thank you for joining me for this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.